On a somber December day in 1791, Antonio Salieri stood among the handful of mourners at the funeral of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. As the Italian composer gazed upon the simple coffin, his heart was heavy with genuine grief for his departed colleague. But little did Salieri know that this moment of sorrow would, in time, become the prelude to his own tragic fate. Antonio Salieri, once a highly regarded figure in the Viennese court, soon found himself at the center of a shocking accusation that he had murdered Mozart. But how could it come to this? How did a man who genuinely mourned the passing of his fellow composer become painted in the eyes of many as a bitter, jealous rival, one who resorted to poisoning his competition? The answer lies in a tragic tale of misunderstanding, rumor, mental decline, and the often cruel whims of human nature. In the early hours of December 5th, 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, at the age of 35, died unexpectedly after a 2-week-long illness. His sudden demise left much of the musical world in shock and disbelief. The circumstances surrounding his death were shrouded in mystery, igniting a firestorm of speculation. A public notice captured the uncertainty of the moment, stating, "Mozart is dead. He returned home from Prague a sick man and continued to get worse. Because his body swelled up after death, some people believe that he was poisoned." Ironically, it was likely Mozart himself who planted the seeds of this rumor. His wife, Constanza, would later recall that towards the end of his life, Mozart had become paranoid, convinced that he was being poisoned. This paranoia, born in the mind of a dying genius, would soon take on a life of its own. For 12 years, the whispers remained just that, whispers. In the meantime, Mozart's posthumous fame had eclipsed that of almost all of his contemporaries. The public, with their insatiable appetite for scandal, latched onto the idea that such a genius could only have been silenced by foul play. After all, wasn't it more exciting to believe that Mozart had died by nefarious means rather than by natural causes? Of course it was. And it didn't take much longer for these whispers to coalesce around a single name: Antonio Salieri. But why him? Well, as fate would have it, Salieri's position of power and influence, coupled with the competitive nature of the Viennese musical scene, made him the perfect scapegoat. By all measures, Salieri was the embodiment of success. By the time Mozart arrived in Vienna in 1781, Salieri, still just 31 years old, had already established himself as a musical powerhouse. He'd written dozens of operas, many of them met with acclaim, and his influence extended far beyond the stage. He was close to Emperor Joseph II, acting as his private teacher and imperial Kapellmeister. He would also go on to tutor prominent composers like Schubert, Liszt, and most famously of all, Beethoven. In short, his position in the Viennese musical hierarchy was unassailable, his talent undeniable. However, the arrival of the 25-year-old Mozart, a former child prodigy, stirred the waters of this musical pond. The young composer's talent was obvious, and his rising fame inevitably led to comparisons with the already established Salieri. But contrary to popular belief, this wasn't exactly a tale of bitter rivalry or murderous jealousy. Instead, it was a story of professional competition, colored more by Mozart's imagination rather than Salieri's actions. Mozart, for all his genius, was not without his flaws. He was prone to fits of jealousy, and often felt that his career was being obstructed by others, particularly Salieri. In his letters, Mozart often expressed concerns about Salieri's influence at court, viewing it as a potential hindrance to his own ambitions. But these fears were largely unfounded. In reality, Mozart posed no real threat to him. As one of the reigning figures at the top of the musical food chain, Salieri had far more important things to concern himself with than sabotaging the career of a young man who had yet to truly prove himself. Any rivalry between the two was largely one-sided, as Salieri's fame and success far eclipsed Mozart's, whose true legacy would only be fully realized after his death. But that's not to say that Mozart was an obscure or irrelevant figure. The younger man was gaining recognition for his talents, and Salieri, as a fellow professional, was surely aware of Mozart's abilities. The two men were well acquainted with each other's work, and generally got on quite well. Salieri conducted some of Mozart's pieces, and in certain instances, the two even collaborated on musical projects. In one of Mozart's final letters, he reported to his wife how Salieri showered him with compliments during a performance of his opera, The Magic Flute. That hardly sounds like the behavior of a man consumed by jealousy. Moreover, Salieri visited Mozart on the day before he died, and was one of the few mourners who followed his coffin on the journey towards his final resting place. Not to mention that years later, he took Mozart's own son under his wing as a student. What kind of bitter, envious rival would show such kindness? But for the gossip-hungry public, these questions were meaningless. Acts of respect and kindness from Salieri were viewed as mere footnotes in the story they were determined to believe. What they craved was scandal, and Salieri fit the role of villain perfectly. The poisoning rumor spread like wildfire, capturing the imaginations of the public, from the nobility down to the common folk. Even prominent figures in the music world, including Gioacchino Rossini and Carl Maria von Weber, found themselves swept up in the tide of speculation. Weber, who happened to be a cousin of Mozart's wife, went so far as to avoid all contact with Salieri upon hearing the rumors. Imagine the anguish Salieri must have felt as he watched his reputation crumble. Once celebrated in the courts of Vienna, he now found himself tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. How must it have felt for Salieri to walk through the streets, knowing that every whisper, every sidelong glance, might be another accusation? As the rumors spread, they took on a life of their own. Each retelling added new details, new motives, new evidence of Salieri's supposed guilt. The story of Mozart's death became a dark fairy tale, with Salieri cast as the villain. It was a role he never auditioned for, yet one he would be forced to play for the rest of his life. As the decades passed, the rumors only gained momentum. Antonio Salieri, now well into his 70s, found himself grappling not only with the weight of false accusations, but also with the cruel hands of dementia. This insidious disease blurred the lines of reality, leaving him unable to distinguish between fact and fiction. And as it turned out, it was this very vulnerability that would set the stage for the proof that solidified his villainous reputation. The autumn of 1823 marked a turning point in Salieri's life. Decades of these cruel and baseless accusations had taken their toll on his already deteriorating mental state, pushing him to the brink of despair. On one dreary November day, in a moment of utter hopelessness, Salieri attempted to take his own life, a tragic act that would only serve to fuel the flames of speculation. During his subsequent hospitalization, Salieri's fragile mind continued to blur the lines between reality and delusion. It was in this state of confusion that he reportedly uttered the words that would haunt his legacy forever, a confession to the murder of Mozart. This confession, if it indeed occurred, should have been dismissed as the ramblings of an elderly man gripped by dementia and overwhelmed by years of false accusations, but it wasn't. Instead, the rumor mill, already primed by years of speculation, seized upon this moment of weakness as irrefutable proof of Salieri's guilt. In 1824, 33 years after Mozart's death, a sensational leaflet was distributed to the audience at one of Beethoven's concerts. It depicted Salieri as Mozart's murderer, watching as the younger composer drank from a poisoned cup. It would seem as though the rumor was still going strong, with no indication of ever letting up. And speaking of Beethoven, perhaps the best existing evidence of the pervasiveness of these rumors comes from his conversation books, little notebooks he used to communicate with others on account of his deafness. Entries from this time period are peppered with references to the rumors. One reads, "Salieri declares that he has poisoned Mozart," while another states, "With Salieri, it is going very badly again. He constantly fantasizes that he is guilty of Mozart's death and that he gave him poison." It's worth noting that Beethoven, who studied with Salieri as a young man and remained friends with the elderly composer, likely didn't believe a word of these accusations. In fact, reading between the lines of these entries suggests that Beethoven was deeply unsettled by the abuse directed at his former teacher. And Beethoven wasn't the only one to shun the rumors. There were many others who rallied to support the elderly maestro. Those who knew him best were eager to attest to his character, expressing disbelief that the man could even be capable of such thoughts. His caretakers, sworn to honesty, stated unequivocally, "We reply, upon our honor and conscience, that we never heard such words uttered by the said Salieri." Furthermore, in a moment of lucidity, Salieri himself declared to a visitor that "there is no truth to the absurd rumor that I poisoned Mozart. It's nothing but spite to tell the world that." But unfortunately, his protestations fell on deaf ears. The public, it seemed, preferred the sensational tale of jealousy and murder to the truth of mutual respect between two composers. Salieri would fight against these rumors until the very end, dying before ever seeing his name fully cleared. His legacy, once marked by significant contributions to music and a reputation as a respected teacher, was ultimately tainted by a cruel rumor that reduced him to a mere caricature of villainy, leaving his true artistry and accomplishments largely forgotten. As the curtain fell on Salieri's life, a new act began, one that would distort his legacy for centuries. Just 5 years after the composer's death in 1825, Alexander Pushkin's play, Mozart and Salieri, hit the stage, further cementing the false narrative of jealousy and murder. This portrayal, immortalized in Peter Schaffer's Amadeus over 150 years later, cemented Salieri's villainous reputation in popular culture. Today, there's even a psychological phenomenon named after him, the Salieri syndrome, referring to feelings of jealousy towards more successful peers. The fact that the name of a well-respected maestro should become synonymous with petty jealousy is actually pretty messed up. The poor man. In the end, it seems like the only thing that was poisoned was Salieri's reputation.